The evidence for God is simply astonishing. It's not what you think. Most people think, well, I don't know how much evidence there is. I believe, I want to believe. Ladies and gentlemen, this is like saying I'm really rooting for gravity, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And you think, listen, if you are honest, it's scary. The evidence is overwhelming. And if you don't want to believe it, the onus is now on you to explain how is it possible you don't believe it.
Hi, I'm John Zmirak, Senior Editor of Stream.org, and I'm here at the palatial studios of Life Outreach International in Euless, Texas. I've come all the way out here to get good sound and video quality so that we can interview one of the best friends of the stream, and indeed the best friends of the church in America, author, entertainer, occasional singer, Eric Metaxas, a good friend of mine too. Hey, Eric, good to see you.
It's great to see you, and to be described that way makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but only a little bit.
I'm all about making people a little bit uncomfortable.
I know. So am I. That's why,
Yeah, people have described me as like the rock in America's shoe. I like to think I'm the sand in the underpants.
Beautiful. That's so beautiful.
Eric, we live in tough times, My job is to write about some of the worst things that happen every day, 5 days a week, for our readers at the stream. And I kind of have to process this stuff in a way that makes rational and theological sense to people. And I got a note the other day from someone who'd read my fun old series of Bad Catholics Guides that I wrote back in the 2000s and up into 2012. And he said, these books are so funny and mellow and easygoing. I wish you could write more books like that. And I said, yeah, so do I. The world is not what it was.
No.
The church is not as funny as it used to be. America, it's not so funny. I feel like I'm somebody who was maybe doing a comedy act on Broadway, and I've been drafted into the Army, and it's World War I, and I'm in the trenches killing rats. And every day I kill at least one rat in my columns at the stream. You've been killing rats too. I mean, you were one of the people who spoke at the Stop the Steal rallies. You alienated old acquaintances and turned off some of your fair weather friends by taking a hard stand on the 2020 election and the need for Americans to rally around election integrity, America's national interests, legitimate national interests, and the threats to religious and personal liberty that the deep state, the oligarchy, and what we could call, I think, the permanent government pose to us. Has it been painful for you, the transition from America to un-America, where we now live?
Well, sure. I mean, it's supposed to be painful because it's evil. And the only question is, what does God say to do in response? That's the only question. And so a lot of people just complain and repeat everything that's horrible. And that is actually, you're helping the dark side if you're doing that. God commands us to be anxious for nothing, but in all things by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, make your requests known unto God. So if something is really bad, you need to take action against it. And one of the most effective things you can do is to pray. A lot of people kind of act like, well, that doesn't really count. That is a lie, folks. If you actually pray, God hears our prayers. And there are tons of people around the world praying against this evil. There's much we can do as well. That's another story. But simply cataloging the trouble and wringing our hands, that plays into the hands of the enemy. And I don't mean Joe Biden.
And of course, there's the other danger where you go, la, 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 everything's fine, la, 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 la.
That's a whole other kind of problem where you think, everything's great. Everything's great. Yeah. This is good. Well, that's those
and
people.
Then you started,
yeah.
Then you start adjusting your standards of what is good to match what is real, so that you can feel good about things.
Well, that's why when I complain about the people who are complaining, I should say, first of all, they're at the head of the class because they do see that things are horrifying, truly, unprecedentedly horrifying in America and around the world. that's good. But if you stop there, you fail. So it's important for us to see what is happening. But if all you do is complain about it and say, what will we do now? You're not helping. Listen, God has always deputized his people to act on behalf of what is wrong with the world. And if we don't do that, we're just part of the broken world, which is really not good. So we do need to pray. We need to take action, be bold, and speak up. And listen, everything you write for the stream, John, it is glorious stuff, and you're doing great work there. And that's why I have you on my program as often as possible. Obviously, now I'm on your program, but I just want to say thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you, Eric. My piece today at stream.org is called "Has the Deep State Finally Broken Us?" And the cover is that picture, now famous, of all the FBI agents who showed up in their Abercrombie and Fitch jean shorts and wraparound sunglasses posing as Trump supporters in the rally this past weekend for the victims of the January 6th political crackdown, the political prisoners of January 6th who are now in the gulag in Washington, D.C., in conditions worse than we kept terrorists in Guantanamo Bay. And in the article, I point out, I saw on Gab, we were all celebrating because we boycotted that rally. And so the feds weren't able to stage a fake insurrection. They weren't able to arrest hundreds of grandmas and veterans and throw them also in the gulag. But what a thing to have to celebrate. We couldn't have a political demonstration on behalf of people unjustly imprisoned in the capital of our own country because we were afraid that federal agents, provocateurs, like the people who thought up the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer and then recruited people, Americans, to supposedly take part in it. We were afraid that agents provocateurs from our own federal agencies would try to put people in prison. So we didn't have a rally. That's a very Eastern European kind of thing to celebrate. Yes. We outwitted the secret police. We avoid all political demonstration. Ha ha ha. Now we're not in gulag.
Right.
Welcome to the new America, folks.
Yeah. It's not going to stay this way forever. People are, they're taking action, they're doing things. And one of the reasons, I know we're ultimately supposed to talk about my new book, but the reason I wrote most of my books and the reason I wrote this new book is Atheism Dead is people need to have hope. Because a lot of times we forget that the evidence is on the side of goodness, truth, and beauty. Right. A lot of times we forget as though that weren't true. It is true, and I have to say I'm excited about it because I always want to give people hope. But this is not, you don't have to try very hard. You just have to look at the facts if the facts are there. Right. And so I'm happy to say that when things get bad, the scripture says God raises up a standard when the enemy comes up. When the enemy comes in like a flood, God raises up a standard. And I want to say that standard is a battle flag. And I really do feel sometimes great things are revealed to us when we need them most. And the stuff that I put in the new book is Atheism Dead. I didn't know half of this stuff, and I'm astonished at how much good news there is. But we need to know it. We need to spread it because we need it. We need good news.
Right. So you're, in a sense, going behind and underneath all the contemporary errors to try to get to the core. The core issue is we don't act, we don't speak, we don't live as if we really, really believe God was real. We sort of try. We kind of act like we're doing Pascal's bet. Well, maybe. But we don't, as a country, live anymore as if the reality of God were as inexorable and stubborn a fact as the law of gravity. And what you're showing in your book is the existence of God is more certain and more unconditional.
Oh, it's more than more certain. It's certain. It's dramatic. I mean, you know what it is, John? I think in the interest of being polite, a lot of people who claim to be people of faith, they believe in the Bible, they behave in many ways as though they don't believe those things out of deference to people who don't believe that way. They don't want to be insulting. But at some point, that becomes silly. And I think that just to be clear, in the book I deal with evidence from science, well, you read the book. I mean, but the evidence from science, it gets ridiculous. I never dreamt that science, I mean hard science, I don't mean, somebody's interpretation. I mean, science points to the idea that if God didn't put us here, then we have nothing that begins to approach that thesis. That's the only explanation that makes sense. Now, you can say, well, I don't want to believe it, but we have to get honest that the evidence has mounted up over the decades, but most people don't know about this evidence, which is why I put it in the book.
Right. And I thought you did a wonderful job of presenting it. And I've read a lot of the sources you drew on, and I thought you did a great job of presenting it in a very clear and insistent and rationally demonstrative way. For instance, let's talk about some of that evidence, okay? Let's go in logical order. The evidence you point to first is the cosmological evidence. The evidence from the basic laws of physics are, as they exist, seem perfectly finely tuned to allow for the existence of life. And the odds that the laws of physics would turn out that way in something like the Big Bang are infinitesimal. You use some examples in the book, like if you were to paint a nickel red and then cover the whole of North America with nickels, 50 miles high, and then cover all the other continents 500 million more times, and then tell somebody to find that red nickel, it would be much more likely than the constants like gravity and electromagnetism, all those basic forces of physics turning out to permit life.
Basically, in the book, the first part of the book is, of course, about science, faith in science. The second part of the book is about biblical archaeology, and the third part of the book is really my arguments against the new atheism and really seeing that they don't have much to say, and in a way being amazed by how intellectually dishonest they have been and how we've allowed them effectively to get away with it, because it gets very silly. But the evidence for what they call the fine-tuned universe, the idea that the more we know from science, the more advanced science is, the less it is possible for us to believe that we just ended up here. I mean, yesterday I was outside in Connecticut, and I looked around and I thought, we have done nothing to create this. In other words, the air you breathe is beautiful. The wind, the breeze is blowing, the sun is shining, the birds are chirping. We did nothing for that. In other words, it's just we ended up being on this planet where I can walk outside and it's beautiful and I can breathe the air and I thought, we have been trained to think that this is somehow normal, that this didn't require an absurd level of engineering and design. And the more you look into it, the more it becomes, it's almost paralyzing, because I thought the evidence has mounted up to a point where the more you look at it, the more you just think, this is creepy, because this is like God might as well be standing in the room. It's that dramatic that especially the evidence for him is so strong.
Especially when you look at all the other planets we have any evidence for. We see just what normal planets look like. Normal planets are toxic. They are hostile to life. They are uninhabitable. That Star Trek universe that's in the back of our heads, that's fiction. That was science fiction. It says so on the VHS box. Okay? And the old idea that the universe was full of life, that life just bubbles up from planets, if they exist, which Carl Sagan propagated when you and I were kids.
Yeah.
We now know that's not true.
But it's hard. But it's hard to get the culture to get this, because we've been drinking that Kool-Aid for decades and decades and decades. So when you say to somebody, look, all the evidence now points in this direction, it's simply hard for people to accept it. Is thinking, what do you mean? All my life, I've believed that life could be on other planets, and that the life just evolved on Earth. And I've heard that over and over for decades, every day. It's just part of the world in which we live. So to accept that that's not true is tough. And that's why there's some of the arguments that I use in the book, Is Atheism Dead? I think they're going to stop some people cold. They're going to have to stop reading and say, how can this be true, except the facts are there? I mean, I'm clearly not just making stuff up.
The old science fiction universe suggested that there's life all around the galaxy because life is something that just happens. It's fairly simple for the random laws of blind chance and mechanism to create life. But in the next part of the book, you show just how that isn't true, how life on Earth is an incredibly unlikely, rare, bizarre phenomenon.
Oh, yeah. Now, to say unlikely, even that implies like there's a degree. We're talking about like, what are the odds if I were to flip a quarter and it lands heads 10,000 times in a row? Like, you can't get it to do it 10 times in a row. Try to do it 10 times in a row. Try to do it 12 times in a row. Then imagine 10,000 times in a row. The numbers are so overwhelming against the existence of life just popping up that it's only because science hasn't kind of kept up. In other words, the science, even if they've discovered this, they're not really broadcasting it. They're not talking about it. And I said, it's time to talk about this. I'm going to put it in a book so people can chew on it, because it is truly, it's kind of like a headline. You know, it's not like, hey, I've got some interesting information. This is like big news.
Right. When Darwin came up with the origin of species, people thought that cells were undifferentiated little balls of goo, like Elmer's glue, a little ball of Elmer's glue.
Right.
It was just very simple, and some force called life, some spark that we will maybe never understand, comes into it at some point, and then it starts replicating, and survival of the fittest constantly nudges it to greater and greater levels of complexity until it turns into human beings. That was the fruit of ignorance, of Victorian era superstition. Once we started looking at the cell, the most primitive bacterium that we know of is more complicated than the most elaborate computer human beings had ever built. But we're supposed to believe that a tornado going through a junkyard built that supercomputer. I've got a great natural structure in South Dakota, called Mount Rushmore, and I want to show you how wind and weather and erosion just happened to form the faces of the 4 presidents, which, by the way, Cher used to believe.
But I mean,
and Sonny had the sad duty of explaining, no, intelligent design is what explains Mount Rushmore. But Mount Rushmore happening by chance is way more likely than the first, most primitive cell happening by tornadoes going through junkyards.
I mean, again, this is so amazing. Now, look, I put this all in the book, so just so people understand that, and because you read it, you understand, it's understandable by, your average reader. You don't need to be a scientist. But this is why I wrote the book, because I thought the fact that most of us don't know any of this is unacceptable. The evidence for God is simply astonishing. It's not what you think. Most people think, well, I don't know how much evidence there is. I believe, I want to believe. Ladies and gentlemen, this is like saying, I'm really rooting for gravity, but I don't know. Yeah. And you think, listen, if you are honest, it's scary. The evidence is overwhelming. And if you don't want to believe it, the onus is now on you to explain how is it possible you don't believe it. And again, I'm not talking about proving that everything in the Bible is true. I'm talking about just the idea of God. You say there's no God. The evidence that there is a God and that those who say there is no God are wrong, to my mind, has become simply overwhelming. And it wasn't that way when we were kids. Today it is.
Essentially, you don't need a leap of faith to accept the idea that there's a creator God. The leap of faith will come with the person of Jesus Christ, with the resurrection. That's where the leap of faith comes. But the leap of faith doesn't start with, well, we could live in an entirely meaningless, undirected, chaotic universe where stuff just happens. No, that's not an option anymore. But that is the world that Darwin and Freud and Marx asserted. All these Victorian ideologies that have creaked on into existence in the 20th and now the 21st centuries, it's as if we still practice alchemy. It's as if we still felt the bumps on people's heads to try to analyze.
But
their
isn't that what it
psychology.
is? You're talking about you're talking about Victorian era science and thinking, and you think, wow, what else did we believe in 1859 that now we know it just ain't so? But that narrative has carried on. That's kind of the thesis of the book. The reason it's titled is Atheism Dead is because in 1966, Time magazine said, "Is God dead?" And it was this kind of narrative. Like, it looks like everything's pointing to the fact that we have outlived this idea. This is mankind's childhood. Now we're moving on, and we can see from science and other things that God is dead. And we've got all these geniuses, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and others, who it's clear that they're struggling how to figure out a world without God. And in my book, I say, is atheism dead? Because all these years have passed, and we now have evidence that we didn't have in 1966. But we're responsible for that evidence. It's like it's been 50 years, and guess what? We have now overwhelming evidence, and we need to update our thinking. It's just the opposite of what Time magazine was purporting, is that the evidence leans against God. Now the evidence is so strongly in the direction of believing in God that, honestly, I mean, I was shocked when I saw more and more of this. I thought, how can this not be known? How can people not know what I'm writing about in the book? And again, it's a limited book, but I just want to kind of touch on these things, and then I get into the biblical archaeology, and there are things that have been discovered, and you say, there's no way. There's no way. So the science, I mean, I want to stick on the science for now, but it goes on and on and on and on, and the evidence is so overwhelming. And I want to say to people, folks, you need to know things have changed. We're in a new day. We're living in exciting times. The evidence for God is astonishing, and you need to acquaint yourself with it so you stop living in half measures as though, well, I hope it's true. It's true.
Yeah. For instance, that famous experiment, where they took what they thought was the primordial ooze, some chemicals, and they shot lightning through it, and that was supposed to be the origin of life.
That was on our tests, like I think in high school or whatever. They said, like, it was just like you could see it in the textbook, right? It's like we settled this in 1952. People always wondered, how do you get life from non-life? How do you go from zero life to simple cells, bacteria? How did we get there? And they go, well, we figured it out in 1952. A couple of students at the University of Chicago, they kind of thought, you know what, the early Earth, maybe 4.5 billion years ago, 4 billion years ago, there was a lot of lightning activity. There was this, the saline oceans, and there was, a little ammonia, a little methane, a little nitrogen. What would happen if lightning strikes that? Is it possible that could lead to life? And so they did an experiment, and they put electricity through a simple solution, and they said, holy cow, we got, from the oxygen, the water, we got some amino acids. Wow, that's the first step. And they acted as though, well, that settles that. Right. We're on our way, and we're going to figure it out. And guess what? 70 years later, not only have they not moved forward from 1952, on the contrary, they've moved backwards. They showed that even what we found in 1952 isn't right. Nobody talks about this. They wanted it to be settled. It's in the textbooks. Everybody shut up. We figured it out. Life came from non-life this way. We don't need God. 70 years later, we know less than nothing about, and you know what? Everybody talks about evolution. Forget evolution. Let's just talk about how do you get life from non-life? How do you get a planet with zero life? Not a cell, not a bacteria, nothing. Like Mars today, like Jupiter, like any planet, there's no life. How do you get life? The answer is, if we know anything, we know that we don't know.
And we know even less. Imagine the last 70 years of scientific progress. 70 years ago, a computer was something that fit in a railroad car. Now, I have one here that has more computing power than was used to send the space shuttle in 1977. But we have made zero progress in what they call abiogenesis, life from non-life. And you talk about James Tour, perhaps the most brilliant nanotechnology expert on the face of the earth, won all sorts of prizes, hundreds of patents, and he says this whole thing is a fraud. It's like alchemists trying to make gold out of lead. They kept it up for hundreds of years. They made zero progress. Life from non-life is a non-starter.
That's exactly what it is, yeah.
That may be the pivot point where people really have to face the impossibility of secular materialism, where there is no explanation for the sudden organization of inert dead chemicals into something that eats and poops and reproduces itself. If you saw sand on a beach gather into the shape of a troll and start to run towards you, you would not think, oh, random chance has generated a troll monster. No, you would run. You should run away. Well, we need to run from that secular materialism, which believes in superstitions like that one.
That troll made of sand is not your friend. Seriously, John, I think the only way, this is why I take the atheists, the new atheists, to task. If you're intellectually honest, folks, it's game over. You can say, I hate Christians, I hate the Bible. You can feel however you want, but intellectually, you don't have a leg to stand on. You can poke holes in the Bible, whatever, but when it comes to what science says about how we got here and whether there's an intelligent designer, a mind that made us, there's not even a contest. I mean, this is the funny thing. There's not even a contest. We were led to believe, like, well, the atheists have some great points, and I think, you know what? They may have some great points about what's wrong with what they see in different faiths and things, and okay, that's legitimate. But when you're talking about asserting there is no God, we just got here, we shouldn't even have that conversation anymore. It is so stunning. And to me, that's the headline. When I wrote this book, I thought, this is heavy. This is like, people are going to have a hard time swallowing this because we have been led to believe for so many decades that, hey, there's a good point to be made for no God. And I think, actually, no, there's not. And I didn't know it myself. I'm a person of strong faith, but I myself didn't know this. And so when I read this, actually, you mentioned James Tour. It was him. It was he who really made me think I need to write this book, because I had bumped in a lot of the other stuff in the book. But when I met him in Houston, he's at Rice University, and I encountered, probably the most brilliant nanoscientist on the planet saying emphatically, we have no clue, zero clue about how life emerged on this planet. The more we know that we know nothing about it. I thought, this is headline. Like, why doesn't the New York Times or whatever say that we've come to this conclusion? Because nobody wants to come to the conclusion. And so James Tour and I in this book are trying to force people to face the facts. It's like Galileo saying, please look through the telescope. I think it will settle the controversy. Do you dare look through the telescope? And people said, no. We don't want to look. We don't want to be tainted by the evidence. We're not going to look through the telescope. That's how I feel about this book. If people don't read the book, they're scared. And you should be scared because the evidence is overwhelming.
And the same thing is true with evolution and the fossil record, and what you work with Stephen Meyer. Stephen Meyer's wonderful book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, which is like the expert grad school version, I would say,
right,
of your book.
Yeah, of the science part of my book, obviously, yeah.
Right, of the science part. And he shows how Darwin repeatedly said, if the fossil record doesn't bear out gradual evolution leading to macro big evolution, then my theory fails. And the fossil record has not shown anything remotely like the tree of life that Darwin anticipated. What
I found funny, and I know we're going to have to go to break here, but I got to tell you, what I found funny is that in this book, I don't even touch on any evolution or Darwin ever, because I said there is so much other stuff. We don't even need to go near that to make our point. Maybe in a follow-up book I'll go into that. But in this book, I don't even talk about that because there is so much other evidence that people need to know the other evidence. We keep talking about this stuff over here. Let's look at this and this and this. And we are going to be more and more and more amazed that the evidence for God, he has allowed us through advanced science to see that his existence is real. That to me is a headline. I know we're out of time.
Yeah, let's take a little break and then we'll talk about the significance of that.